Hey, good afternoon. It's 1:33, so we will begin our panel, O'Connor's Encounters with the World. I'm the moderator and the last presenter, Farrell O'Gorman. I'll say a little bit more about my background when I come around. But we're going to proceed with our presentations in the order that we have them in the program. And of course, we'll have Q&A discussion after all three of the presentations. Our first presenter is Linda Crenshaw, who teaches at Austin Peay State University in Tennessee, and her scholarly interests are in Southern literature and in Tennessee literature, more recently in particular. And then second, we'll have Rosemary McGee, who spent her career at Emory University and has been involved in O'Connor scholarship from the beginning. Conversations with Flannery O'Connor being a book that Rosemary edited at the beginning of her career, and also was very central to acquiring the O'Connor archival material at Emory. So we'll begin with Linda, then Rosemary, and I'll go last.
As far away as New York or San Francisco, other writers spoke of Ben Folly with awe and planned to visit there as if making a pilgrimage. It was a milieu where writers influenced each other. Encouragement and criticisms were equally expected. Even detachment had its place. One can think of no other creative center like it ever having existed. That's Sally Wood on Ben Folly. Caroline Gordon to Sally Wood. I have been sewing madly for 2 days, crouched in a welter of young men from Vanderbilt. This is the time for the annual eruption. I have never seen anything like the way they come. Some I never even heard of before they appeared yesterday. The object of these comments is a house in Clarksville, Tennessee, which was owned by Caroline Gordon and Alan Tate from 1930 to 1938. Built in the 1830s, the house was purchased for the Tate Gordons by Tate's brother Ben, who was, unlike Alan, a wealthy businessman. Gordon had strong roots in the area, having been born nearby on her family farm called Marymount, and Tate had ties there as well, having been born in Kentucky and educated at Vanderbilt. They named the place Ben's Folly, then shortened it to Ben Folly as a nod to what folks thought about Alan's brother's purchase. This is how the house looked when they lived there. Here are Tate and Gordon at Ben Folly. Gordon wrote to Sally Wood, "Our hill, probably the most beautiful hill in the world, will not bother you. It's shaped just like a crouching lion. The lion's head and shoulders front the river, and the house sits on, say, his forehead." This is the way a writer describes a house, right? One drives up his spinal column right to the front door. The ascent is gradual, and you do not realize till you get out on the big porch how high up you are. It's swell at night when the lights in the town come out. Gordon notes that Tate's desire for a farm had been mostly theoretical. He joked about the irony of how industrialism, his brother's money earned in the coal industry, had allowed him to live out the ideals of agrarianism, while Gordon took to farm living more naturally. Alan, she said, has the strangest attitude toward the country, the same appreciation you'd have for a good seat in the theater. I think Alan feels toward nature as I do toward mathematics, respectful indifference. He walks about the garden hailing each tomato and melon with amazement and never sees any connection between planting seeds and eating fruit. Looking at the area surrounding Ben Folly, we see that this part of the country was the center of one of the most influential artistic and critical movements of the 20th century. Clarksville is about 45 miles northwest of Nashville, home of Vanderbilt University, where the fugitive agrarians did their work in the 20s and 30s, and Nashville's right in the middle. It was here that Alan Tate met Robert Penn Warren, who was born in Guthrie, Kentucky, which is about 10 miles from Clarksville. And he graduated from Clarksville High School. Warren knew Caroline Gordon, who was the only girl who attended her father's classical school for boys in Clarksville, and he introduced Tate to Gordon. Another relevant spot On our map is Smyrna, the home of O'Connor's friends Francis and Brainerd Cheney, which is a little bit south east of Nashville. It was Gordon, of course, who introduced O'Connor to the Cheneys after serving as their sponsor when they converted to Catholicism. Tate and Gordon married in 1925, and by the time they moved to Benfally, they befriended not only the writers associated with the Fugitive Agrarians, Andrew Lytle, Cleonth Brooks, John Crow Ransom, Donald Davidson, John Gould Fletcher, but also Ford Maddox Ford, who'd been Gordon's mentor in New York City when she was working on her first novel, Robert Lowell, Catherine M. Porter, Malcolm Cowley, Edmund Wilson, Louise Bogan. I could go on. These are some of the writers who made pilgrimages to Benfally. You'll notice that many of these writers were later known to O'Connor, having met Paul Ingle, Andrew Lytle, Robbie McCauley, and Alan Tate, who later claimed not to remember her, at Iowa in the 40s. Here's a painting by Janice Biala, who accompanied her partner Ford Maddox Ford to Benfally in the summer of 1937. The painting captures some of the creativity and organized chaos described by Gordon and writers who visited Benfally during this time. Another of her paintings was called All the Adults Were Writing Books. Ford Maddox Ford describes life at Benfally this way. This is one of the noisiest spots in the world, what with children and chickens and birds and cows and steamboats and Tennessean voices and doors slamming in the winds. Consorting with the Tates is like living with intellectual desperados in the Sargasso Sea. Here are Biala and Ford being greeted by Tate at the front of the house. Catherine M. Porter was too distracted by the natural beauty of Benfally to write. Gordon says, she made mint liqueur, preserved peaches, made 5 gallons of elderberry wine, brandied peaches, and would have brandied and preserved more if I had provided her with them. Here, Porter is pictured with a cow named Daisy Miller. Here are Gordon, Biala, Ford, and Tate enjoying a picnic on the grounds. I wish very much for both professional and personal reasons that I could tell you that Flannery O'Connor was one of the writers who visited Benfally, one of those adults who were writing books. I would have nothing more to say that if you squint just so, you'll see her leaning against a tree in the background of this photograph. However, despite local folklore and online rumors, I cannot. O'Connor's first connection with Gordon was in 1951, when Robert Fitzgerald asked Gordon to review Wise Blood. Gordon and O'Connor met for the first time a year later, almost 15 years after Benfally had been sold. Having said that, Gordon and O'Connor's interaction, one based on mutual respect, a willingness to give criticism and receive it, a belief in the power of art and the value of revision, has its roots in what happened at Benfally in the 30s. The features that define the Benfally gatherings appear strikingly in the Gordon O'Connor letters. Gordon had come to value the benefit of collaboration, revision, and mentoring even before she and Tate moved to Benfally. She experienced this with Ford Maddox Ford as she worked on her first novel, as well as in her interaction with Sally Wood when both women were young novelists writing in a male-dominated world. We might see this relationship as prefiguring the special relationship Gordon developed with O'Connor. Howard Horsford, in writing about the relationship of Gordon and Wood, says the close friendship between the two women, perhaps Caroline's closest, developed partly because they were both deeply interested in the craft of fiction, and Caroline had then virtually no other woman with whom to talk. Alan, of course, like male writers generally, always had other men talking poetry with him. And perhaps it was partly because of, over the years, when creativity flagged, they seemed to revitalize each other. We might say the same thing about the relationship between Caroline Gordon and Flannery O'Connor. My esteemed panel mate, Rosemary McGee, says of O'Connor and Gordon's relationship, they were defined by a set of intertwining circles, communities not contained by time or space, without the comforts of a shared college campus or the hospitality of a literary establishment. Here's some more of what we know about what went on at Ben Folly when the Tates were there. When Sally Wood visited in 1930, she described the setup of the house where the writers did their writing and revising. She talks about a long dining room table that reached from the front to the back of the house with a large fireplace. Everybody always wants to be in the kitchen, right? Because that's where, that's where these writers mostly were. She describes the routine Gordon established for the group. One of her habits was never to let anyone get into serious conversations at breakfast. It was certainly true that being distracted then often spoiled a morning's work. At Ben Folly, everyone was free to go directly to his or her own typewriter. And although guests came and went, we know that no matter who was in attendance, the group wrote with intensity and dedication. They valued community, and they believed wholeheartedly in critique, revision, and the value of producing serious art. We see Gordon employing those values in her communication with O'Connor, just as one of many examples. She's writing to O'Connor about the enduring chill, and Gordon says, "What I have to say further is about your style in general. This takes me back to first principles, principles which I can name outright to you, but which I have to approach cautiously with my secular pupils. There's only one plot, the scheme of redemption. All other plots, if they're any good, are splinters off this basic plot." She goes on to say, "There's only one author, the HG, Holy Ghost. If he condescends to speak at times through a well-constructed detective story, which I think he does, he will certainly condescend to speak often through FOC." And she goes on to talk about very specific suggestions that O'Connor should enact, right, to revise The Enduring Chill. And again, we see the artistic values Gordon honed during her years at Ben Folly here, doing the hard work of getting a story right, the importance of community in drafting a story, the insistence on getting just the right word in keeping with new critical ideology. They had this exchange about the word squinch. You know, that O'Connor keeps using the word squinch and Gordon keeps saying, "You really should not use the word squinch." And then she just ignores her and keeps using the word squinch, you know, but it goes on and on across several letters. They also have this kind of shorthand that comes from shared experience, from community. For example, when Gordon says, "Principles which I can name outright to you, but which I have to approach cautiously with other people." And also, they share the desire to create fiction with a Catholic worldview. So as much as I want O'Connor to have been at Ben Folly, I might console myself by thinking that the milieu that Sally Wood describes helped forge the relationship between O'Connor and Gordon, the mentorship that was so crucial to O'Connor's work as a writer. And as difficult as it is to acknowledge that the writers' community that happened at Ben Folly when the Tate Gordons were there lasted less than a decade, we might be heartened by thinking that not only does the Ben Folly experience continue in O'Connor's fiction, in some ways it continues in real life. The current owners of Ben Folly see themselves as caretakers of not just the property, but of its legacy. They host students, writing groups, and sometimes curious individuals. This is what Ben Folly looks like today. This is what the Tate Gordons call the gallery, which overlooks the Cumberland River. It's up on a bluff. It's up on a bluff, and it has a striking view of the Cumberland River, which is a major tributary to the Mississippi. If you fly into Nashville, that's the river you're flying over. This is current owner Stuart Bonington, who is a retired psychology professor from Austin Peay, beside the koi pond on the property with some students. This is a sculpture on the grounds by artist Olin Bryant, whom you may be familiar with. They leave this sculpture outside, even though it's very valuable. This is Stuart and Peggy in what they call the sharecropper's cabin on the woods. They use the cabin sometimes for retreats, for impromptu concerts, and afternoon tea. This is Stuart and Peggy by the koi pond on the grounds again with some students. Unfortunately, Peggy had a neck brace on that day, but she's fine. Don't worry about her. It's just that one day. And this is another shot of Stuart with the house behind him. And there's a group of students, and there's Peggy with the walking stick, and then Stuart, of course, in the hat and purple shirt. And then here are some photographs that I commissioned just for you all. This has been Folly a couple of days ago. These were made by my friend and colleague, Susan Bryant. And she told me she wanted you all to, she said, I'm going to go take some pictures and hopefully I can capture for them the magic that has been Folly. This is the grounds. Front porch. Another shot of the front porch. Some more of the grounds. At my last visit to Ben Folly, I asked Stuart if they had ever seen any ghosts. It's an old house with a rich history. And he said, no. And then he admitted that from time to time, there's a cat who appears on the property at the back door, stays a couple of days, leaves for a couple of weeks, comes back, and they have named him Tate.
There's the house. See the person?
Try.
No.
Oh, I saw it. Flicker.
Yeah, hold on.
Anybody?
No, we'll get
You
it.
got it?
We're gonna get it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, here, well, what do you need? Here comes.
I think we're good.
Okay.
You know? That's, I think, let's go back to yours and then. Yeah. There we go.
Thanks, Carol, and thanks, Stefan, for being so present for everyone. And thanks to you all for being here. Isn't this a great conference? And special thanks to Linda, whom we never met until a few minutes ago, but seems like our topics actually overlap. So transatlantic correspondences, the friendships of Flannery O'Connor, Sally Fitzgerald, and Eric Langmuir. I'm going to share a bit of my written comments with you. We're going to travel very quickly through a set of slides that somehow ended up in this presentation, but are relevant, and then get to some of the central ones. So first, I feel like if you were here, we could talk about 1,000,000 years without stopping. Flannery O'Connor inserted as a handwritten postscript in a letter to Eric Langmuir in April of 1955. They had come to know one another first in Milledgeville in 1953, where he was a traveling textbook salesman, and then through correspondence from 54 to 58 after he returned home to Denmark. This heartfelt expression crossed with one of his own letters from Denmark announcing an impending marriage. Thereafter, the active phase of this relationship ebbed and ultimately ceased, as has been well documented by Sally Fitzgerald, Mark Boscow, Brad Gooch, and others. Yet the significance continued, and not only in O'Connor's lifetime. Less well known is the extended correspondence between Sally Fitzgerald and Eric Langmuir, as Fitzgerald pursued her self-described detective work into O'Connor's life and letters. Through cross-continental correspondence and meetings in Denmark, and even vacations with the Langmuirs in Perugia at the Fitzgerald's villa there, we learn about Langmuir and Fitzgerald and their reflections on O'Connor. With access to both sides of this extended conversation from 1979 to 1993, we gained further perspective on Fitzgerald's complicated life as well as her dogged determinism and Langmuir's thoughtful reciprocity. In one note, he writes to Fitzgerald, "Well, now this letter has gone on longer than one of our late night discussions." Fitzgerald later relates that we would have a long argument about our diverse interpretation of good country people if she were still in Denmark, as she had visited him earlier. Today, we're looking at both of the two transatlantic correspondences shaping O'Connor's life and legacy. Moreover, I hope to bring to fresh light on the mutually influential friendships between Flannery O'Connor, Sally Fitzgerald, and Eric Langmuir. Many of these papers coexisting and exerting mutual influence in the Stuart A. Rose manuscript and archives and rare book library at Emory. It seemed necessary and fitting when Sally's papers came to Emory after her death. Their arrival in the early 2000s was as much an act of fate as good fortune, given the many years from 1981 to 1997, Fitzgerald made Emory her home away from home. I knew her quite well in this era. Within the 21 boxes of expansive correspondence, along with notebooks, photographs, interviews, lectures, draft reviews, and news clippings, are as well the primary sources that tell the story of friendships that Sally formed in the midst of encountering and exploring O'Connor's friendships, including my own connection and correspondent and interviews over 20 years. When I came to know her, I was a graduate student who participated in a colloquium that first brought Sally Fitzgerald to the Emory campus. Shortly after the publication happened to being, I found this document, this brochure, where my name is listed as one of the organizers as a graduate student in the Sally Fitzgerald papers. I also found the paper that she gave at Emory. We had asked her to talk about stranger in her homeland. That was the topic of her talk. But she says when she gets there, she tells us she didn't ever like that topic, that it doesn't really fit O'Connor, and that the human condition, no matter what its customs or where it resides, is the subject matter of her stories. So O'Connor had no wish to be regarded as a stranger in her homeland. Georgia was both her birthplace and her true home. And here is some my early correspondence where I invited Sally to do an interview with me, and she politely declines. This is in this box and there in the Rose Library that I'm rediscovering these materials. And I subsequently did get Sally to agree to an interview in the year 2000, shortly before she died. And in that interview, which is published in the Flannery O'Connor View, Sally says, "O'Connor reached out to me when I needed work. Even in death, she was a friend. She reached out to me when I most needed work." So more on that slide in a second. So all of the possibilities for renewed proximity for the two friends, that is O'Connor and Fitzgerald, proved momentous in 2013 when we at Emory announced the arrival of a considerable archive of O'Connor's papers at Emory to the Rose Library. I had the privilege, when I assumed my role as director, to focus on the Flannery O'Connor papers, among others, and through a connection that I already had with Louise Thornport, first cousin of O'Connor and co-trustee then of the Flannery O'Connor Trust, as described in a very lively fashion by Bruce Gentry just yesterday. Over multiple trips from Atlanta to Savannah, where I had family, my helpful husband and my friendly dog and I would stop in Milledgeville at the rambling antebellum mansion at Green Street, also known as the Klein House or the Florencourt House, which had been part of their family for well over a century. We bonded in a relationship. I was never, the snake never bit me. I was lucky in that regard. I saw that snake biting others. We bonded in a relationship that was to continue until her death in 2023 at age 96. Nestled among the papers. So here's Louise and me at the opening of the archive there in the middle, and then some of my visits. And on several occasions, Louise and I had hat parties there at her place. And before she died, she asked me what of her items that she personally owned would I like to have. And I said, I'd like to have one of her hats. And I actually ended up with 3, but there's one there. So this is actually mimicking a photograph that we have in the Rose Library, where I'm also standing in front of a mirror, and where we see O'Connor here as one of the world's first selfies. And then here are some of the materials. So nestled among the papers that made their way from Milledgeville to Emory are vivid letters of O'Connor to her mother, marked up story drafts, childhood photographs, quirky responses to class assignments that offer profound insight into Flannery's imagination and yearnings. Diaries, poems, drawings, mistaken identity, a self-published book in several versions highlights the young O'Connor's resolve to create something of unusual import about a goose who thinks it's a gander until an egg materializes. So these are, really wonderful and beautiful materials that we have and were used in the exhibition we did on O'Connor, Betty Andrews, and Alice Walker. A part of that exhibition that I focused on was the correspondence, and which, as we know, we know so much about, in large part due to Sally Fitzgerald. And I'll go through just a few more of these O'Connor slides, related slides, Betty Hester, and that amazing correspondence. The letters in the Fitzgerald collection are also mesmerizing. I found myself particularly drawn to the correspondence she exchanged with Eric Langmuir, the Danish man who once had a relationship with O'Connor. What's remarkable about this file is that not only does it track the course of his relationship with O'Connor in Milledgeville when he was still a salesman in the 1950s, we also learn the contradictory views on whether he was in any way represented in her short story, Good Country People, although indeed very different from the salesman in that story. The discussion of that topic and the correspondence between Langmuir and O'Connor then arose 20 years later between him and Fitzgerald in a most compelling way. Through the searching and finding of the letters, including shared visits in Denmark and Italy, Sally and Eyre became close friends themselves. Flannery's friends became Sally's too. Sally Fitzgerald's dedication to preserving the legacy of her friend ensured a lasting record of O'Connor's life, and indeed to some large extent her own. Given this focus, she acknowledged in that interview that O'Connor had a profound influence on her own life. I feel she really befriended me. She reflected on a final interview with me in the spring of 2000. Something similar arises in other correspondence files. While it's true that Robert Fitzgerald introduced O'Connor to novelist Caroline Gordon, and that he and Sally nurtured that relationship even further, what we learn from the Fitzgerald papers is how close Sally Fitzgerald and Caroline Gordon become in the years that follow, during the creation of The Habit of Being and until Gordon's death in 1981. And Caroline was the person who brought Sally in touch with Eric. She knew where he was in Denmark. Trees often form a circle, just like friendship, a tree ring, and they have rings inside of them that bear witness to their own history and growth. And there are offshoots, and that's the way it is with archives. What may have been messy piles, file drawers, assortments of correspondence or whatnot become in the archive arranged according to chronology or topic or person. But there is a bow of connectivity what I grasp among all these papers is that not only do we experience the habits of friendship, which is my larger project, in a particular moment or place in time, but I, sitting there in the Rose Library or any library, can find the connections, the branches of the tree that reach out to me as well. Through the archives, friendships continue over time and place, even extending to me and to all of us. And now I will share you some more slides related to the Lanier-Fitzgerald relationship. As we know, Sally Fitzgerald believed that a true likeness will be painted by herself, a self-portrait in words to be found in her letters. That is also true for Sally, by the way. One more point I will add, in the same box where Eric Lanier's letters are to Sally and hers to him is my small file of correspondence with Sally. And that's how I came across the Lanier materials. Saw that there, had my name on it. I thought, I'm going to look through it. And, you know, L is right before M, as we know. And there I discovered these. So the wonder of serendipity. And in there as well is the story of Sally Fitzgerald saying the first time I ever saw Flannery O'Connor was in February 1949, and where they are drawn together by Robert Lowell. I remember still how struck I was by her large blue shining eyes. She said almost nothing. She happened to meet, thanks to Robert Lowell, both the Fitzgeralds and Robert Giroux in the same day. I'm questioning the assumption that Flannery O'Connor did not like New York City or big cities. It was a turning point in her own life to be there. And there are wonderful stories related to that. There's Robert Lowell himself with one of his letters. Sorry for the poor photography, but he talks about how much he cares about her and frequently in letters. There are Alan Tate and Caroline Gordon. When Robert Fitzgerald first introduces Caroline to O'Connor's work, Wise Blood, she writes back, "This girl is a real novelist." Sally and Robert Fitzgerald, Flannery O'Connor, of course, she lived with the Fitzgeralds for a time. And there's Sally in the middle at a Milledgeville conference. And on this side with Betty Hester and Bill Sessions and Bill's wife as well. And there's Sally and Regina. My conversations with Caroline Gordon took place in Mexico when I visited there in 1958. She sent me in the right direction to find him, Eric, by telling me he'd gone back to live in Denmark permanently. It was only after a transatlantic telephone search, an exchange of letters, and a trip to Copenhagen to meet the Laniers that he told me the whole story of their acquaintance. And this is from a mass there in Denmark. I wish I could translate that for you. Here's an envelope that Eric wrote to her very soon thereafter. And here is some of the correspondence that is copies of which are in the Fitzgerald files that are of the O'Connor correspondence with Eric. I haven't seen any dirt road since you left, and I miss you, she writes to him. And then I feel like if you were here, we could talk for about 1 million years. So this is in the Sally Fitzgerald file, copies of which Eric had given her of these letters. And the correspondence that O'Connor and Eric have about whether or not she models the Bible salesman after Eric. And she says, you know, please remove this delusion from your head at once. And also the idea that it's a spiritual autobiography, move that at once. Your contribution to it was large in the matter of properties, by which we think she means, you know, books, but never let it be said that I don't make the most of experience and information. But as to the main pattern of that story, it is one of deceit, which I certainly never connected with you. in my own modest way, I think it's a wonderful story. I read it over and over again, read it over and over again. Nobody enjoys it as much as I do, which is more or less the case with all of the productions. We know that feeling. And, here's a copy of an inscription of wise blood to Eric. And there are photographs in the Sally Fitzgerald file of Eric Langmuir in Milledgeville, sitting on the front steps of Andalusia. And these are just examples, postcards pertaining to the voluminous correspondence between the two of them. And Eric's letter to Sally shortly after she returns to Cambridge, Massachusetts from Denmark. And this is this extended correspondence that they have about good country people. To coin a phrase, this is Eric, that Mrs. Hopeful might have said, had she only thought of it, life certainly springs all sorts of surprises on you. He was, so pleasantly surprised by her visit to him in Denmark. About good country people, her letter to me commenting on my reaction to the story is so self-contradictory. I am, she wrote, about Eric, not the Bible salesman, yet she considers it more tactful not to have sent me the story, nor is it her spiritual biography, yet she always has been able to see whatever experiences came her way. So she's saying yes and no at the same time. And then she says, and he had been quoted, somebody had said, Flannery, I can't remember who Flannery said it to, I think Betty Hester, that this was something she used to go with. And at the end of this lengthy correspondence, which Eric denies that the relationship was more than just a friendship, but that she was very highly invested in him, and it meant a lot to him. And then he says, in the PS, maybe after all, Flannery had a right to say she used to go with him. And then this is, again, Eric writing to Sally when Sally says, her own point of view, he's about good country people. He says, I have a hard time letting go of my own interpretation, though I remain a bit loath to let go of my feeling that Poynter is not as irredeemable as you make him out to be. So the whole question that they're conferring on is this act of whether or not he is redeemable. And Sally says, if I were still in Nivea, we could have a long argument. Again, this idea of the lengthy correspondence about our diverse interpretation of good country people. We are, of course, agreed that the story concerns yourself and herself, but we see the relevance somewhat differently. I agree the salesman was not meant to be irredeemable. He has a long way to go, however, in a different direction, and that his path is nowhere indicated in this story. Note, the Bible is hollowed out, an instrument of deceit. And then regarding this photograph that Eric had shared with Flannery, I clearly recall Flannery's extreme reluctance to have her picture taken and a refusal to be photographed standing beside her own self-portrait. Instead, she took my picture with the back of the painting turned toward the camera. Again, more evidence of the massive correspondence between the two of them, Sally and Eric, and then also them sharing important details about their lives. And Sally sharing with him that Robert Fitzgerald had died earlier in the year. Of course, they had been alienated and divorced, although Sally never acknowledged the divorce. And she talks about the last time she saw Robert Fitzgerald, where she feels that there is a reconnection through the priest having, he told me then called me to tell me that he had called a priest who would be coming to the house the next morning to give him the last sacrament. After that, my children tell me he seemed altogether peaceful. This is an intimate detail that she's sharing with Eric Langmuir. And Eric goes to Italy and writes to her about being there, enjoying the beautiful terrace of the Fitzgeralds. And again, a letter from Sally Fitzgerald regarding Caroline Gordon. And the one exception to my having had an influence on the commentary, this is what Eric says to Sally, maybe the reference to the Bible salesman, since you know, I already knew that Good Country People would not have been written without me. And he asks her about why her biography has been delayed, et cetera. She responds to that question. And then she writes a paper for a Milledgeville conference called Patterns of Friendship that later turns into a piece. This was that was 50 pages long, had been asked for by the New Yorker, but then rejected because it was much too long, and then is eventually published there in the Georgia Review. To the extent that it would seem fair to say that despite her disclaimer, Sally concludes, Good Country People does represent, if not her spiritual autobiography, at least a crucial event recast in tragic, comically grotesque fiction form in her emotional history, one that propelled her into another dimension of the spirit, a reminder of the kind of life demanded by her extraordinary vocation and circumstances. And as you can see, it was in the Georgia Review, and you can see her meticulous editing of her own work and her preciseness in language. And so from my perspective, my lifelong project has been about literary friendships. Friendship was clearly of central importance, not only to Flannery's personal enjoyment in her short, trying life, but also to the enrichment and development of her literary gifts and the exercise of her art. When her friend A wrote to her in 1955 that her stories fairly screamed that she had never consented to be in love, Flannery replied, in that case, they scream an inaccuracy. So there we are. That was a brief tour of the Eric Lanier and Sally Fitzgerald correspondence. And it is much richer than what I can here. I'm going to give you all a brief summary.
I've got a little handout packet, which does not contain all of my slides, but a few interesting ones. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute this.
Let's see.
Okay, all right.
Okay.
So I am not, I've been going to conferences for about 30 years and I have never given a PowerPoint presentation before. Somehow I've avoided it. But I feel like for today, it's appropriate for what I'm doing, but I apologize for the amateurism of my slides. I hope you'll get something out of it anyway, because I'm going to give you a kind of archival tour as well. That's largely what I'm going to be doing here. I want you to have the experience of seeing some of these things for the first time. But to introduce what I'm doing here, let's get on my materials. My name is Farrell O'Gorman, and I wrote my dissertation on Flannery O'Connor and Walker Percy as Catholic writers from the South. I knew that's what I wanted to do when I went to graduate school. And so I started that work, again, about 30 years ago. And I've written elsewhere on O'Connor more broadly in relation to American literature. But in 2023, I became the co-trustee of the Flannery O'Connor Trust, along with Father Michael Garanzini. And my presentation today stems directly from that. So many of you know that
many of you may have seen that at Milledgeville on O'Connor's birthday, there was a celebration of her artwork, which was reported on in the New York Times, et cetera, which included some artwork which was recently discovered in the Green Street House, but also some artwork that the trust, Louise Florencourt in particular, had held on to for quite a long time and people knew about, but it just never been publicly displayed. Well, in addition to that artwork, there are other O'Connor materials that have not been made public before, but they will be soon. And so I was on sabbatical in fall of 2024, and I spent time going through a number of boxes of materials, some of which belong to O'Connor, many of which belong to her mother, Regina O'Connor, that were stored together with the art. This material is being given to Georgia College and will be available to scholars in the months and years to come. I don't know exactly what the timeline is going to be, but I can maybe answer questions about that if they come up. But I'm going to give you a brief introduction today to some of the books that belong to O'Connor that you would think would be in Arthur Kinney's 1983 book, Flannery O'Connor's Library, Resources of Being, because that book catalogs all of O'Connor's library that's held at Georgia College and has details about a lot of the annotations in the books. Well, what I found going through these boxes last fall were books that were not there. And there are over 200 books that come from different parts of O'Connor's life. So going back to her childhood, high school and college textbooks, books that she used in Iowa, at the Iowa Writers Workshop, books that she read as a mature writer. I'm not going to give you a bibliography of all these books today in the annotations. I can't do that today. It will be available to you over time, but I'm going to give you a sampling. And so this is not only is this my only PowerPoint, this is an unusual presentation for me in that I haven't written it out. I'm just kind of talking through it. And I don't have a thesis. I am just presenting data. That is what I'm doing. I'm giving you, so I could give you I'll give you some context for thinking about some of the things I'm going to show you, but I'm not going to push interpretations. These are things that people will have to read and interpret on their own, but I think people will be just interested to see what I have. And so in trying to, select how to introduce some of this material, talking with the conference organizers here, I just chose to go with, well, sources that have something to say about how O'Connor saw Europe. And so that ranges quite a bit, and I'm being kind of liberal in my approach to it in some ways, but that's the thread that's running through the things that I'm going to present to you here. And again, they're going to be from different stages in O'Connor's life. So first thing, this is a little bit of a silly way to begin, but the New York Times reported that the art was found in a storage unit in Milledgeville behind the Cookout, which is, a fast food restaurant on the road from Georgia College to Andalusia. I just want to correct that slightly because this storage unit, it is partly behind the Cookout, but it's a big storage unit, and part of it is behind Tipsy's liquor store. So if you look here, this is the storage unit back here. Here's the Cookout. Here's Tipsy's liquor store, and yeah, this is a storage unit that contained the artwork and many of the materials that I'm about to show you. But they were removed from there in the summer of 2023, and they've been in temporary storage at the Andalusia Interpretive Center in Milledgeville since then. And again, the formal gift is being given to Georgia College, so they'll be cataloged and made more widely available soon. So here is the first book that I'm going to mention to you. So American Poetry and Prose, this is a textbook. It's signed M.F. O'Connor, 1944. And so presumably this is a book that she is using in a class at Georgia College. And since this is O'Connor Reads Europe, why American Poetry and Prose? There's a lot that's marked in there, poetry by Robert Frost, for example. But one of the most heavily annotated portions of this book are excerpts from the writing of Henry Adams. So Henry Adams, as many of you know, was the great-grandson of John Adams, grandson of John Quincy Adams. His father was the American ambassador to the UK. Henry Adams was a historian himself, and is best known for his book, The Education of Henry Adams. And if you've heard of one chapter from The Education of Henry Adams, anybody?
Dynamo.
The Dynamo and the Virgin. Yeah, the Dynamo and the Virgin. So there are actually 3 excerpts from Henry Adams in this textbook. One is from the Dynamo and the Virgin, and this is one of the slides that I've given you. I know I don't have this much text in the rest of the presentation, but what you have here underlined are sections of Adams's text. It's printed in the book like in dual columns, so it would have been confusing to take a photo here. But these are Adams's words that were marked by O'Connor. You all got a hard copy of this as well as what's here. So in the Dynamo and the Virgin, Henry and Adams is visiting a World's Fair, I believe, in Paris, and he's thinking about the dynamo, science, obsession with energy and the way it's shaping modernity. And in his mind, he's contrasting it, of course, with medieval Europe, which is shaped by the Virgin rather than the dynamo. And so Adams is an interesting figure because he's not Christ haunted, but Virgin haunted in a certain way, and Europe haunted. So he's an American who feels, to oversimplify, I think, a certain nostalgia for medieval Europe and the Virgin. But here's what O'Connor marked, the sections that are underlined here, although her marks were marginalizing. The force of the Virgin was still felt at Lourdes and seemed to be as potent as X-rays. But in America, neither Venus nor Virgin ever had value as force, at most as sentiment. No American had ever been truly afraid of either. Adams continues, I'm not going to read all of his text here, but if you look down to the bottom of that middle paragraph, he introduces quotations from Lucretius, invoking Venus as thou who alone above all governs the things of nature. And Dante, I believe this is from the end of Paradiso, invoking the Virgin, Lady, thou art so great and hast such worth that if there be he who would have grace, yet betaketh himself not to thee, his longing seeketh to fly without wings. O'Connor marks after this, all this was to American thought as though it had never existed. The true American knew something of the facts, but nothing of the feelings. He read the letter, but he never felt the law. So again, I'm not going to offer a lot of interpretation, but it seems there she's suggesting that Americans read Dante, but they don't have the cultural context or the faith that he, even though Adams himself was not a professing Christian or a Catholic, he had a certain nostalgia for in Europe. Another quote down there at the bottom, Adams began to ponder, asking himself whether he knew of any American artist who had ever insisted on the power of sex, as every classic has always done. But he could only think of Walt Whitman and 1 or 2 others. All the rest had used sex for sentiment, never for force. American art, like the American language and American education, was as far as possible sexless. Society regarded this victory over sex as its greatest triumph. And I think you can see at the bottom of the handout, if not on the slide, O'Connor put a check mark in that section. She likes the check marks. And she wrote Howells, William Dean Howells. I believe she's referring to William Dean Howells, the 19th century American writer and critic. But yeah, there are other sections of this textbook, again, that O'Connor is reading as a senior in college, I believe, where she seems particularly engaged with Henry Adams. And it's interesting because many people are surprised that O'Connor, as a Catholic, doesn't seem to talk much about the Virgin in her letters. And it's interesting that this early engagement with Henry Adams is there. So I'm not going to give any more of that. Okay, here's another textbook. Chief Modern Poets of England and America, 1944. So again, we can assume that this is a Georgia College textbook, and I think it would be easy to go back and figure out which class she's looking at this in. I will note that this one doesn't have her name in it. It's got Mr. John Smith of Garden City Publishing Company in Augusta, Georgia, but this seems to be O'Connor's handwriting. And if you look elsewhere, there's more of her handwriting, and you can't really see the table of contents. Sorry about my photography there, but there are lots of check marks So she's got lots of check marks by Thomas Hardy, Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is a little bit further on. This is Yeats up at the top left-hand side, a lot of check marks by Yeats. George W. Russell, or A.E., the Irish poet. Then there's W.H. Davies, a British poet that I don't know much about, but she's got a lot of X marks by Davies rather than check marks. Okay, so you could go, if you had this book in front of you, you could flip through it and find annotations by a number of these authors, but I'm just going to show you a little bit from Hardy and from Yeats. And I'm not going to read this poem, but I will read the annotation, which you might not be able to make out. This is a poem called By the Earth's Corpse, which is by Thomas Hardy, I guess circa 1900, early 1900s. That's his era. And here's what O'Connor has to say in the margin. Hardy says God has been careless with the world and regrets it to the extent that he's sorry he made it in the first place. Poor Hardy. In parentheses. Yeah. Here's another one, The Oxen, where if you read the poem, there's one speaker who's imagining that on Christmas Eve, oxen are kneeling, and it's thinking of the manger. And the speaker of the poem is saying, I'm not sure I can believe that, but I wish I could. And so O'Connor writes in the margin, like Hausman, A.E. Hausman, would like to recapture the faith of his childhood. Right. So that's her comment on Hardy's The Oxen. Okay, next, Yeats. And I'm just going to talk about one poem here, A Prayer for My Daughter. I think I gave you this one, even though I think the most interesting annotation is not on this page. I'm going to share it with you in a second. This is Yeats's, Yeats's A Prayer for My Daughter. The title says it all. And Yeats is on in the second stanza here, he's imagining his daughter growing older and he fears for her. Imagining an excited reverie that the future years had come, dancing to a frenzied drum out of the murderous innocence of the sea, which O'Connor has underlined. Down at the bottom, she's written Venus, just a little footnote there. And I'm going to, a bit more about this poem, but I'm actually going to read it to you first before I show you the annotation. The poem goes on where Yeats is imagining the future that he wants for his daughter, and he hopes that she will be learned in courtesy and exhibit a glad kindness. May she become a flourishing hidden tree, that all her thoughts may like the linnet be, and have no business but dispensing round their magnanimities of sound. Nor but in merriment begin a chase, nor but in merriment a quarrel. Oh, may she live like some green laurel, rooted in one dear perpetual place. That's what Yeats wants for his daughter. What does O'Connor have to say? Can you make out what's in the corner there? Poor girl. Yeah. Okay. So again, there's a lot more in this textbook, but those are just a couple of poets. Here's Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And I didn't make it to Mary Gordon's talk. I got here a bit late. I heard that she talked a little bit about Woolf in her talk. Well, I found this book and I picked it up and I thought, well, O'Connor's not that interested in Woolf. There's not going to be much here, but I was wrong. So To the Lighthouse, she mentions as having read at Iowa. And I assume that's where she read it here. So let's just look at the text here for a second. And then I think I gave you a copy of this, right? This is early in the book. This is page 10 of To the Lighthouse, which it's been a long time since I read it. But early on, the Ramsey family is thinking about going to the lighthouse. And Mrs. Ramsey has told the children, the weather's going to be good. We're going to make it. And in the middle of this page, we're getting the focus on a young boy, James Ramsey, who is described as being examined by his mother. But then in the middle of the page, his father speaks. But, said his father, stopping in front of the drawing window, it won't be fine. The weather won't be fine. We won't be able to go to the lighthouse. Had there been an axe handy or a poker, any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him, there and then James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breast by his mere presence. He's 6 years old. So this is James. This is O'Connor's first marginal marking. But if you look at it, what's she doing? She's not commenting on the content. She's commenting on how the narrative works. Gets dramatic effect by contrast of what is said to what is thought, right? That's what she's seeing on this page. And not all, but many of the annotations in To the Lighthouse are of that nature. So this is not just my photography. Actually, the pencil is faded on the page, but this is on the inside flyleaf. And To the Lighthouse is broken into 3 parts. The first part is called The Window. And so what does O'Connor write here? The window. Purpose to give you the characters to illuminate them. Self-characterized and characterized by other characters, but seldom, if ever, by the author. Structure very simple. Texture of writing makes it seem complex. So again, O'Connor observing structure there more than anything else. This is, I think I may have given you this one. Well, I'm not going to take the time to talk about it at length, but this is a moment where Mr. Ramsay, who's a philosopher, is engaging in a kind of reverie while his family is outside and he's looking at them from a distance. So, you know, in a lot of O'Connor's fiction, we have the intellectual who is detached and living in his head or her head, right, rather than in the physical world around them. And I wouldn't necessarily have thought of Virginia Woolf in connection with that, but I think maybe that's what O'Connor is seeing in this paragraph that's striking her. Just up at the top of the page here, the one complete person in the book, Mrs. Ramsay. The one complete person in the book, Mrs. Ramsay. So the mother figure, O'Connor is just making a note there. Okay, so I do think I could say more about you know, some of the books that I found, but I'm trying to go again with European authors, British authors, and we're coming to the end here. I guess I have to make the case that the limerick is a European form. It is not necessarily Irish from the little bit of research that I've done on this, but I guess it is a European form. That's what I'm going with. And I'm just going to share with you very last thing here. This was something that I read and I really enjoyed, because who knows when O'Connor got this, right? It's M.F. O'Connor, so it's before she goes to Iowa. This could be, I think, at any point from maybe when she's 10 years old to 20 years old, who knows, probably on the younger side. But she has a number of these little blue books, which are about the size of a postcard. But this is the one that really grabbed my attention, a book of humorous limericks. So we're going to look at just a few of these that O'Connor marked. So these are her favorite limericks in this book of limericks. Well, well. There was an old monk of Siberia whose existence grew drearier and drearier. He burst from his cell with a hell of a yell and eloped with the Mother Superior. I'm going to skip over some of these. There was an old man of Calcutta who had an unfortunate stutter. I would like, he once said, some bread and some butter. How Homer should have written the Iliad. There was a young man named Achilles whose wrongs always gave him the willies. So he sulked in his tent like a half-witted gent. Say, wasn't them heroes the sillies? Lord, she is thine. There once was a lady from Guam who said, now the ocean's so calm, I will swim for a lark. She encountered a shark. Let us now sing the 90th psalm. And to end on a European note, here are 2 poems, The Court of St. James. I sat next to Duchess at tea. It was just as I feared it would be. Her rumblings abdominal were simply phenomenal, and everyone thought it was me. From the capitalist press. Yelled a communist, down with the Pope, and all the crowned heads of Europe. Equal rights is our creed. What more do we need? Then somebody shouted out soap. So that's all I had. And again, I feel like what I found is like an island. And I've shown you some snapshots of the island. There's a lot that's there, and I'm hesitant to try and talk about it all, but I could talk with people about it individually, maybe answer a few general questions. But what I've tried to give you in the time that we've had here so far is just a sense of what's there. So thank you for your attention. And we've got, let's see, we've got just over 20 minutes left for Q&A, so we'll open it up to the audience.
Actually, a question for you, Farrell. What does a library reveal about her interest in our Irish heritage, both historical and literary?
Repeat the first part.
What does her library reveal about her interest in our Irish heritage, both historical and literary?
Yeah, good question. Not much as far as new things, you mean? Or just generally?
In general, yes.
In general.
And you, sorry.
Right. Well, in asking that question, I actually think first to her letters. I think that what you get from her letters is she doesn't talk a lot about her Irish heritage. I think what she reveals in her letters is she doesn't like she doesn't like Irish Americans who think they know what it is to be Irish and who talk a lot about being Irish. But she says in one of her later letters that the actual Irish people she's met are lovely.
She also can't stand St. Patrick's Day as it's celebrated in Savannah.
As it's celebrated in Savannah, Georgia. Right, exactly. She has, some level of engagement with Joyce. I mean, she did repeatedly recommend Dubliners for anybody who wants to know how to write a short story. I'll tell you that actually one of the books that I found was Ulysses. And as with many books, I opened it thinking, what am I going to find here? And I found nothing. But I don't know what that means. And that's another reason I hesitate to talk about some of these things, because I also found some Dostoevsky, like The Idiot, and it's really clear she admired and read Dostoevsky carefully, but there are no annotations in that. But I do think she admired Joyce as a short story writer. It's one way to answer your question. Dave.
So I had a question about the correspondence between O'Connor and Eric Langer. There was, and I don't know if it was the interview. Oh yes, it was Father Mark Bosco's interview with Eric Langer, right, where it's revealed in the correspondence between O'Connor and Langer that, or at least suggested that one of the reasons she was so keen to the plight of displaced persons is because of the family history of Eric Langer and the refugee status of his family. Can you speak to that at all?
I can speak to some of that. He had a very troubled life, and as a small child, his parents were separated, and he lived in Denmark and the U.S. and other very complicated. And in fact, Sally, in her initial paper that turned out to be the one that focuses on Eric in the much shortened form in the Georgia Review, the expansive version, the 50-page version, there was even a longer version where she wrote down in detail a lot about him, his background, his sadness as well. And so there in the archive is a lengthy description of her, which she sends to Eric and asks him to correct and edit and add to as necessary, which he does do, and sends it back to her. and with some suggestions. And it even goes into his then current life, where his wife Meta had suffered from, it appears to be some form of serious mental illness for a time. It was institutionalized, and she has that in there. But then he says, out of respect for Meta, you know, these other people are either long gone, or don't really care that much about what they think, but I do about her. I have that information. I don't have all of it at the tip of my head, but yes, there was, and that is one of the things that really draws them together, because of course Sally suffered a lot in her life. She had all sorts of physical ailments, as did her children. And, you know, and the separation from Robert and then divorce was tragic for her. She never referred to Robert Fitzgerald without saying, my husband, Robert Fitzgerald. She considered him to be her husband, even though he had divorced and remarried. So, so I think they felt a shared sense of a kind of displacement, and also with O'Connor's focus on that as well. I don't know if that really answers your question, but there is a full description of all of this in these materials.
I think that my interest was, that's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, my interest is, there was something mentioned, I think maybe Angela O'Donnell yesterday, and just sort of off the cuff, listening to the effect, well, I don't know how empathetic O'Connor was. And, you know, that was just a passing thing that she said.
Yes, I heard that too.
It would be easy, I think, to see O'Connor in that way, just the persona of her persona on the page, perhaps. But
yeah, so I was talking mostly about Sally and Eric.
Sure.
Yeah, but you're talking about O'Connor and Eric. Yeah, well, you know, we don't have much evidence. There are only 12 of those letters, and they're all hers. But she definitely has been touched by him.
yes,
Touched by his story, and she knew and read his aunt, who was an important historian or literary scholar, and so she, yeah, she definitely has a lot of empathy for him, and she has a lot of empathy for him being a traveling salesman from Denmark, and you know, seeking her out. Yeah, so I have no question whatsoever that that does exist there, and many other letters as well.
You know what I'm thinking of too, is I was just reading the letters, you know, Gordon wrote some letters to Brainerd Cheney and his wife together, and they're talking about the Tate Gordon marriage. You know, they were both very close to Caroline Gordon, and they're talking about Alan Tate, and Gordon's approach is, you know, he was behaving badly, and her approach is, please pray for him. I'm worried about Alan's soul. And then Flannery writes to the Cheneys that very thing. She's like, I'm really worried about this situation. We have to do everything we can to pray for Caroline and Alan. You know, she's very empathetic toward that situation, much more empathetic than a lot of people have been to Alan Tate.
Other.
Rosemary, I wanted to ask if is this part of your book on literary friendships?
I feel like my book is somewhat like Sally Fitzgerald's biography of Flannery, which, by the way, we thought we would find when the Fitzgerald papers came to Emory, but and she had told me in that conversation in May of 2000, shortly before she died, that the book was essentially finished, but it was not in the papers. And what was in the papers was a series of smaller and important pieces, many of them, talks that she had given, here, there, and everywhere, as well as articles that she had written, and several really important ones about Caroline Gordon, one of them masterclass, that were published in the Georgia Review. So my so-called book project on this is much like Sally's. I have a lot of bits and pieces scattered here and there, but now that I'm retired, suppose it's all going to come together in some radical way.
There's Dorian.
So having spent a little time, just when I was working in the archives, I was looking at her library. My impression was that she just really didn't annotate her fiction books, or at least the ones that I had looked at, and she annotated her nonfiction more. So I was excited to see she wrote anything into the Lighthouse, but I'm wondering if that is what you're seeing in the text that you're finding now. And I also wonder what was up with that. Like why I wonder why she didn't annotate her fiction. If that is even the case, but.
Yeah, that's a good question. I do think that general pattern, right, in the material that's everybody already knows about it is there, that there's more annotation in nonfiction than the fiction. I'm trying to think. There is, I mean, the Henry Adams is not nonfiction, I suppose. Is that pattern there generally? Maybe so in the newer material.
I think partly because in fiction, you don't really like, I mean, I personally annotate a lot of nonfiction. But in fiction, unless I'm studying certain books for structure and, you know, looking at the toolbox, you know, how it's working, I don't annotate. So maybe that's partly it.
Yeah, my sense is that there's something to that she read for the love of it. And I do think that the addition to the Lighthouse that she had was kind of a textbook at Iowa, where she's writing down some of the comments that are being given by a professor. Others, Bob?
Rosemary, one of the things I've been trying to understand for a long time is Sally Fitzgerald's sort of understanding of Flannery O'Connor. Especially given the fact everyone that you talk to talks about the friendship and importance of stuff. And yet when Sally goes to edit her essays, she rewrites O'Connor. And then 15 to 16 years later, she takes out those revisions and gives us a smaller number of essays by O'Connor. Do you have a sense of what was going on in her mind, and how she was changing and how she saw Flannery?
Well, I think Sally felt that she was the official interpreter of Flannery O'Connor, and that gave her broad license. And that she had a special kind of relationship with her, and that maybe she understood her better than she even understood herself. And that kind of editing also, or editing like that and other types, also takes place in the letters. Like if you go through the correspondence that we have in our archives and you compare it to what is actually in the habit of being, there are some huge differences, and they're major important. There are some important gaps as well. So she made a lot of decisions there. Now, some of those decisions, at least with regard to the letters, were her own decisions, I feel, but also some was from things that she felt like would cast Flannery in a bad light, or that Regina didn't want. And of course, she had to struggle with Regina, you know, over the years. And so I don't know as much about Mystery and Manners. But of course, theoretically, she was working on that with Robert, you know. However, you know, both their names are on it, and I'm sure he was involved to some extent. But when Robert is asked to edit the letters, he says to, I guess it's Drew, he says, I can't do it now, I'm too busy, but ask Sally. She did the other one. And she talks about in my interview with her of carrying these papers across the ocean from Massachusetts to Italy, these mounds and piles of papers, that she's working on it constantly. But, you know, why she specifically made those edits and then shifts in her perspective. By that time, she may have felt like she had a little bit more license or comprehension, but she was, you know, I mean, I knew her well, I admire her, but, you know, she had a clear vision of herself as the interpreter. And I was just talking to someone the other day, well, it was actually with Bruce, and she and Ralph Wood got into a big fight at a Milledgeville conference, a huge dispute. I don't know if any of you were there, And then it had to do with the controversial title of one of her short stories, and how intentional that was and how racist it was and what was her role and the role of John Crow Ransom. And then afterwards, Sally felt like it got cut off and not reported carefully. So she writes to the Flannery O'Connor Review, or as it's called, wasn't called the Review at first, it's called something else. The Bulletin, Flannery O'Connor Bulletin, and she insists on having this long rebuttal there. And then Ralph is mad that it's published. And so the two of them, you know, have this similar sense of purpose in life, this teleology, if you will, that they are the appointed interpreters. I'm sure that doesn't really answer your question, but it's an interesting.
It's just always such a curious experience. You read something in Mystery and Manners and you're going to use it in an article. And so you go to get the collected works and it's not there. The whole essay is not there.
Yeah.
And you're going, well, you know, and Sally gives in her favor, she gives a little description of what she's doing in Mystery and Manners. She says, I'm taking lectures and pulling pieces, but oh my gosh, taking pieces from people's work and making them into a whole, that's a big step.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so you curated what you presented today from just sort of with the theme of Europe in mind and things like that. But I was going to ask what else stood out to you, a few pieces that she annotated that you thought were interesting.
Other particularly interesting, you're just asking for other.
Yeah, or if there were any other heavily annotated things that you came across that were surprising.
Yeah, and if I hesitate to answer, it's not because I'm trying to be evasive, it's because all this material, I moved it from the storage unit behind Tipsy's Liquor with Matt Davis, who was the director of historic museums at Georgia College, who it's done a lot with the Andalusian Interpretive Center. And Matt knows a lot more about archiving than I do. I'm not an archivist, I know that. And Matt said it would take a professional archivist 6 months of nonstop work to catalog all of this material. So it's not just the books. And a lot of what's there that's in these boxes, and I'm talking about our Regina's financial records. I mean, there's a lot of things that are not that exciting, although some of them may be. Carol Schloss would be very interested in some of these materials that are in there. But related to that, I spent about 120 hours. I tried to check in and check out with my time, about 120 hours going through these 120 boxes. And I did it just looking for big things and flipping through books to see what's annotated and stopping on the things that really looked interesting. But I easily could have missed something. So I don't want to create a misimpression. Once Georgia College has had these things formally archived and cataloged, there may be a different picture than the one that I have right now. That said, I mean, To the Lighthouse definitely stood out to me as somebody can write at least an article on that. I mean, there's a lot in there, even if it is just a textbook. It's really interesting. And I do think that some of the marginal lining are just passages that engaged O'Connor on multiple levels. Maybe she is thinking about the narrative structure, but she's also just interested in the content. So there's a lot there. Ellen Glasgow's Barron Ground is a novel by a Southern novelist who's not as well known today. I think she,
Very important.
yeah, very
According to
important.
O'Connor.
Yeah. So there are significant annotations in Barron Ground, which is published 1920s. Is that right? 1920s, 1930s. A Southern realist from Virginia writing about rural life in Virginia. There's definitely something there. I do think all the poetry, right? She had a lot. There's a lot in the Robert Frost section of some of the textbook, and that kind of makes sense, right? That O'Connor would engage with Frost, at least when she's a college student and beyond.
It definitely gives a lot of insight. I've done a lot of work on Virginia Woolf, and I know that O'Connor's attitude towards her is not positive generally in her commentary on it. And but just seeing those was fascinating because she's clearly really engaging to the lighthouse on a different level. So I think that's poised for all kinds of revelations. So.
Yeah, and I was looking back, I mean, I've never thought much about this, about Wolf in relation to O'Connor before, but I'm pretty late in the habit of being, the last time she mentions Wolf, she talks about Wolf seeing fiction as a laboratory. And that makes sense. And I don't think she's saying it there in a disparaging way. She said something about the way Hemingway sees fiction and the way that Wolf sees it, and neither of them is exactly what she's doing, but she's making the point. I also, what she's saying in the paragraph, I think, is I don't want to define the novel in such a way that it would leave me out of it. I think it's with Betty Hester, she's discussing what a novel is, but so I think she's not ultimately as disparaging of Wolf as we may generally.
Can I ask one other question? I was recently going through Kenny again, and that one thing that struck me is that it seems like the overwhelming number of books are religious. And I'm wondering if that percentage is going to change.
Good question. So there are actually, I went back through, I've got a list, but it's an amateur rough draft bibliography is what I would, with some of my speculations sort of written in it. What I think will ultimately happen, what should happen, is that once this is cataloged by Georgia College, the Flannery O'Connor Review should print a full formal bibliography, and maybe that can be in the next issue. I don't know. That's not ultimately up to me. But almost 300 of these are something called the Encyclopedia of Catholicism. This really surprised me. It was a mid-20th century publication. It's online now. Yeah, I was kind of surprised to see it. And there are not a lot of annotations from those books, but that kind of tilts the numbers. But I'm not sure how closely O'Connor read those. Did somebody give that to her? You know, I don't know. Then 27 of the books are little blue books, like the Humorous Limericks one. A significant number are children's books, children's books, high school books. About 70, I went back and looked, about 70 are literary fiction or literature, Shakespeare, for example, as well as a lot of novels. So in the early 60s, I think she felt like she needed to read more Shakespeare. And so there are some really nice editions of Shakespeare's plays that are all printed in the early 1960s that she's got there, but I'm not sure, those aren't annotated. But about 70 of these books are authors such as the ones that I've listed, that Flaubert, Russians, Turgenev, as well as Dostoevsky. And again, some of the books, I would expect all of Dostoevsky would be heavily annotated, but it's not. No Kierkegaard that I recall, I don't think so. Yeah, there's not a lot of, other than the Encyclopedia of Catholicism, there's nothing that's theological as a single thing that stands out to me. I should also say that in addition to these books, there are a lot of academic journals and literary journals that she read that are there too, that I didn't talk about at all. So she subscribed to Thought, a Fordham publication from way back when, a theological and philosophical publication called Thought. There are a lot of hard copies, right? Her copies that have some annotations in them. The Sewanee Review, the Kenyon Review. Yeah, and some of those have some annotations. And those will be at Georgia College as well. Any final question? We're right at the end of time, but does anybody have a final question for our other panelists or?
Yeah, a good question. If you wouldn't mind, is there any sense from the work that you've done on the Tate House, the way that O'Connor was relating to the agrarian? You know, we know a little bit, but I didn't know if you discovered anything else.
I think her main interest in that group was in new criticism and not so much the politics. And, you know, obviously the stories are these perfect and critical stories. That's what Gordon taught her job was. She thought that was really, really important to get these stories into the kind of shape that the new critics demanded, really. And so she largely seems to have stayed away from the politics of that. I will say one thing quickly. Her friendship with the Cheneys is really interesting because Brainerd Cheney worked for a Democratic Tennessee governor who was a speechwriter. And he asked O'Connor to write a letter, basically a letter of recommendation for him. And he said, I do this with some trepidation because I know you don't like politics. And she basically says, I don't like politics, but I like you. So that was kind of tiptoeing into that. But as far as the ideas that we associate with the fugitive agrarian, really does not seem to have been as much interested in them as the critical purchase.
Right, and she was very influenced by Robert Penhorn and Alan Tate when she was at Iowa.
Yes, and John Corbett.
And John Corbett.
Okay, we're at time. Thank you all.